Tonight we just want to discuss one verse, again verse number 19, in which he's basically giving his son two important points to keep in mind. And he says, وَقْصِدْ فِي مَشْيِكَ وَاغْضُضْ مِنْ صَوْتِكَ إِنَّ أَنْكَرَ الْأَصْوَاتِ لَصَوْتُ الْحَمِيرِ. Be moderate in your walking and in your talking. Indeed, the most unpleasant sound is the braying of the donkeys. And so here we see that Luqman is talking to his son about two important points. And both we can look at it at the literal point of view, from the literal perspective that he's talking about exactly how you walk and how you physically walk on the earth. And also on a metaphorical level, not physically walking, but how you carry yourself, for example, in public. And also in the second part where he talks about his speaking, when he says, lower your voice or be moderate in your speech, in the way that you talk. This can also be perceived as being in the literal sense of not yelling, not screaming, not shouting, remaining cool and calm and collected. And it also could refer to what is being spoken about as well. So we have two really basically aspects of this verse that we could look at. One of the things, before I go into more of the discussion, is the choice of words of Luqman and the choice of words that Allah has given to us in this verse, where he says, waqsid fi mashyik. This word, waqsid, the command that he's using, where we've translated as being moderate, it has multiple meanings in the Arabic. As we know, a lot of these words, and in any language, one word can come with multiple meanings and connotations. And so one of the meanings of this word is moderation. It also means a balance, an equilibrium. And so sometimes we hear this theme within the Quran about not going to two extremes within Islam. For example, not giving everything away in charity, nor giving nothing, but maintaining a moderate stance between the two. And even in acts of ibadat, acts of worship, we're not told, for example, to spend your entire day in ibadat, in worship, in prayer, for example, and to, just cut yourself off from the world. Nor are we told, let's say with fasting, to fast every single day of the month, right? There's always in Islam a moderation in everything that we do. And so here Luqman is talking to his son at that first level, where he says, waqsid fi mashyik, that when it comes to walking, maintain a standard course of walking. We'll look at some other traditions about this later on. And he also reminds him, waghdud min sawtik. And even this word, waghdud, that you've seen this, I'm sure, in the Quran, when Allah talks about the hijab. Right? When Allah talks in Surah Nur about the hijab, Allah first off talks to the men and addresses the men. And He tells us that, oh men, that when you're in the presence of women who you're not related to, those who are what we call the non-mahram, Allah says to what? He says to lower your gaze. He says lower your gaze and guard your modesty. Then Allah talks about the hijab of the women. But at first level is the men have to lower their eyes or be moderate in how they look at the opposite gender. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that you're always walking or looking with your eyes to the ground or not, for example, making eye contact. Here we can again say if it means being moderate in your gaze, you're not staring at the opposite gender, an individual whom you're not related to. You're not staring at them with that lustful glance. But rather you're maintaining a moderation in your glance. Obviously, when you're at a business level, you're interacting with your employees or your co-workers of the opposite gender, or you're at school, you're interacting with your classmates in a certain way if they're of the opposite gender. And obviously, when you're with family, there's another way. And so he's showing us that when it comes to even the walking and the talking, that maintain a sense of moderation, maintain a sense of dignity and composure in how things are being said, and also, for example, how and what also is being said. He then gives his son a very interesting example. He says that indeed the worst of sounds, the worst of voices, or the most unpleasant of sounds is the braying of a donkey. And I'm sure we've all heard how a donkey sounds. If you don't know it, just go home and Google it tonight and hear the sound of a donkey. But, he's getting a point across that, there are sometimes people who speak too much, who say too many things, and when they don't have to talk. And sometimes when you're around those kind of people, they don't get a hint. They don't get the hint when you're trying to maybe ask them politely, to cut the conversation short. sometimes they feel that they just have to say everything that's on their mind. And obviously every person is unique in how they interact. But at the same time, as he shows us that, this always speaking or using a loud voice or just saying things which maybe shouldn't always be said, that he compares this to the sound of a donkey. And he said that is one of the most hateful of sounds, obviously to human beings, because it's a very annoying sound. When you listen to it, it's a very high-pitched, annoying sound. And sometimes you may encounter people like this, where they're talking, but you've just tuned them out, because it's just gibberish coming out of their mouth. But because we have akhlaq, we have adab, we don't tell somebody to be quiet, or many times we won't, right? We'll put up with it, we'll bear it. But he's showing him that, it's not something which is pleased. It's not something that Allah is pleased with, or even people are happy with. But many times we as believers, we don't want to insult or, humiliate the individual, so we put up with that. We just, let it go, basically. One of the interesting things when I was looking in this verse is when you do any kind of reading or research about human conduct and behavior. And, I'm sure we all know this. We have this saying in English that actions speak louder than words. A first impression is the last impression. If you're, for example, an employer and you're hiring somebody, you're going to judge them in the very first few seconds you meet them. What they're wearing, for example. How they enter into the interview room. How they say hello to you. A lot of these things, even nonverbal, will give you clues as to the person and their character. And you don't even have to have them speak, right? Everything which is nonverbal will probably convey a lot about that individual. And once they come to start to speak and talk about themselves, then you'll probably be able to validate your thoughts at that first meeting. And so we see that even in this verse, when Luqman is telling his son, and obviously as an extension to us, Allah is sharing this with us, is because that nonverbal communication that we have, it has such an impact on the human psyche. Just to give you a few examples of quotations that are available. We're told that the clothes that we wear, the way that we walk, our facial features, our body language, our tone of voice, your doodles, your hobbies, and the music that you prefer can reveal a lot about your personality, right? So everything about us, again, when you see somebody, for example, downtown with ripped clothing, pushing a shopping cart, right? We automatically perceive that that's a homeless individual, right? So we make those judgments in our mind right away by seeing somebody, how they look, how they're walking. A lot of these things we'll judge a person, and then if they speak, then we'll either say, yeah, I was right, or no, I had it wrong. So even in our culture where we say, don't judge a book by its cover, we still know that eventually we all do that, right? Both, when we meet people, we always end up judging them by what we see on the outward perspective. We also see that the way that a person walks, however, it doesn't only reflect the personal traits, but also as the researchers of the human mind, they say that it also reflects a person's current mood. And there's a lot of research available online. You can look at it in psychology magazines where they've actually gone into the detail of analyzing how people walk. If their head is pointing up towards the sky, or if they're walking with their face down, what mood that they're in. Or for example, if they're walking and they're swinging from side to side. All of the ways that people walk, the experts of the human mind, they do all of this research. And they can tell certain traits and characteristics about the individual just from the way that we walk and talk and the way that we basically carry ourselves in public. Let me share with us just a few hadith that we have that come from the Prophet and the family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wa sallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And literally in this section, when you look at hadith of the human being, there are probably thousands of hadith. In fact, even Shaykh al-Amali, the compiler of one of our major books of hadith, one of the major sources called Wasail al-Shia, a 20-volume compendium of a hadith, he has an entire book, an entire section of maybe 200 pages just on hadith of human interaction. Hadith from the Prophet and from the Imams alayhimus salam, in which they basically are presenting us with every single aspect of how to walk, how to talk, how to interact, what things we should do, what things we shouldn't do. And obviously a lot of them, they go and they look at the Rasulullah and how the Prophet used to interact with people at his time, how he used to walk with the people, how he used to interact with society around him. And obviously it goes much deeper than that, but that's one of the areas. And obviously then the general teachings of Rasulullah. So just two or so hadith that I want to point out tonight. The first one comes to us from Rasulullah, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And in this tradition he says, the one who walks upon the earth with pride and arrogance will find that the earth itself, the earth that we walk on, he says, you'll find that that would do lanat on the individual. And all of those above the earth and under the earth will invoke the la'na, meaning they will invoke Allah to remove His mercy from us. This is what la'nat means. When we say la'nat, we literally mean that we make a dua to Allah to remove the mercy from an individual. And so Rasulullah says that whoever walks on this earth with pride, with arrogance, thinking that they're somebody, he says that earth, the ground that we walk on will actually make dua to Allah against us. That Allah should remove His mercy from us because we are acting in a proud, boastful manner. And as we know, only Allah has the right to have pride. Out of all the Asma'ul Husna, Al-Mutakabbir is one of those names reserved for Allah. So as human beings, we don't have a right, as we even talked about yesterday, to have arrogance or pride within ourselves for any reason. Another hadith that we have comes from our 8th Imam, Imam Rada alayhi salam, about silence, about not always speaking, right? Not always having to open our mouth and say something. And he says that one of the signs of a person who has a deep understanding of religion, what we read in the ahkam or in the hadith as called fiqh or tafaqquh, having a deep understanding of Islam, he says there are three signs. One is knowledge, the second is forbearance, patience, and then he said silence is the third thing. And he says indeed silence is a door from the doors of wisdom. Right? So it's a problem when you have people who just constantly talk and want to share their opinion. There's no problem having a discussion and talking about issues, but we also, obviously as believers, we have to realize our limits, that we can't always be talking. We can't always just be talking for the sake of wanting to say something, to draw attention to us, for people to think that we maybe know more than we actually do. And so we even see this theme within the hadith on a frequent basis about remaining silent, about only speaking when we have to speak, when it becomes necessary. And the third and last hadith on this, and we'll close with just some lessons to learn from this verse tonight, is where Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali alayhi salam, addresses the actual root cause of pride, of all of these negative ethical traits. And he says there's not a single individual who shows pride or an oppressive individual who commits oppression except that they do so because they have a shortcoming within their own self. So you see somebody who's pride and trying to boast to the society, he's got an internal problem. He's got some internal conflict with himself. He's got some internal psychological issues he's having trouble dealing with. When you see an oppressive person, somebody who's unfair, not a tyrant in a government level, but even a person in a family, maybe you have a father who is not being fair to his wife. Maybe he's, beating the children. Na'udhu billah. He's not giving the rights to his wife or his spouse or the children or the family members. Obviously, you have to address that as well. But you also have to go and address the root cause of why is he acting like that? Why is he being such a bully within the household? Why is a bully at school, for example, in the playground, why is he bullying other kids who are younger than him? There's some other issue that's underlying within that person's psychology. And obviously that has to be addressed. It's not enough to just ground them or suspend them from school. Obviously the experts would need to go and find out why that child is doing what they're doing. And Imam Ali shows us that this is something to do with that individual. There's some insecurity or something that they're feeling inside. And they are basically taking it out on the outside world. And so we have to realize that these are all problems within the human being, and we have to address those at the root cause. Yeah, you can, for example, stop an oppressor. You can remove a government from, a person from governmental office if he's doing things which he's not allowed. But you know what? When he continues in his career, those things will continue, but in another form. You can stop the grade 5er from bullying kids in the playground, but guess what? Next year when he's in grade 6, a bit bigger, a bit, chunkier, a bit tougher, he's going to pick on still children who are younger than him. And maybe when he gets to be, a professional and he has his own business or he's working for a company, maybe that bullying may continue if he hasn't been able to control it when he's young. We'll close with a few lessons to learn from this particular verse today, from verse number 19 of Surah Luqman. One of the first things that we see is that when within the divine teachings that Allah gives to us, theology or aqaid always goes hand in hand with morality, with akhlaq. So in the beginning of this section, when we remember the advice of Luqman, and actually where Allah interjected, it was about Allah. Ya bunayya la tushrik billah, as Luqman said. And now here it's about how you walk, how you talk. Right? So Islam is a religion not only of theology, not only about these theoretical concepts about Allah, about prophethood, about Day of Judgment. Islam is also about how you and I interact with one another. You can't be a good Muslim just because you believe in Allah and you believe in the Prophet and the Imams and Day of Judgment. You also have to be a good human being in order to be a complete Muslim. You can't, use vulgarities and be harsh with people and say, well, I'm a good Muslim, I pray and I fast and I believe in Allah. That belief has to be translated into action, and here that action is our akhlaq, our morality, how we are to other human beings. And not only human beings, I extend that to how we even treat animals, because we've talked about this in the past, but Islam even has very strict conditions on how you treat animals, even your pets that you have at home, or a stray dog you might find in the street, or a cat. How do you treat these animals? Islam even came with that level of teachings within this faith. We also see the moderation in life, keeping away from two extremes and having that constancy in the way is always emphasized in the Quran. Not only walking, not only charity, but as a community of believers, we have to realize that Islam is not a religion of extremism. We have never been taught to be extremists in religion in any form, and especially as the media uses this word extreme, Muslim extremists. Unfortunately, it's a label that they have attributed to Muslims because of what they see certain people doing. But really, when you read and understand Islam, you'll see there is no room for extremism in that way or in any way. We're not extremists in any act of worship. Praying, we don't go to the extremes. Charity, we don't go to the extremes. Fasting, we don't go to the extreme. None of these things are a part and parcel of our religion. There's always a moderation in everything that we follow within our religion. We also see that in this hadith, in this verse rather, that it's not only the way that we walk, but rather in all those aspects, we have to have that balance within our lives. And last but not least, and we'll end with these last 2 points, is that when we are speaking to other individuals, we have to learn to keep our voices down and speak calmly and not scream and shout and use all of those loud voices. We have to be calm, have a soft speech. This goes whether you're in a debate. Allah talks about when you debate with non-believers, Allah doesn't say yell and scream and shout to get them to accept your way. He says, "Ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati wal maw'idati al hasana." Invite other people to the way of Allah, to the way of your Lord, with hikmah, with wisdom, and with good exhortation. He doesn't say stand out on the corner of the street on downtown and start yelling at people as they come by. No, it's about inviting people to the path. It's an invitation. If they want to reject it, they're free to reject an invitation. Allah says use wisdom, use good words, and introduce people to the path of Islam. Even in the du'as, sometimes you go to communities and people will be screaming their heads out in the middle of a du'a Kumail, du'a Abu Hamza, du'a Tawassul. There's no need to scream. Allah, even in one of the hadith, a non-Muslim comes to Rasulullah, a polytheist, and he says, should I yell at the top of my lungs? Is Allah so far away that I have to yell at the top of my lungs? Or do I whisper because Allah is so close to me? Where is Allah? And the Prophet told us there's no need to yell, there's no need to scream and shout, as Allah says that He's closer to us in our jugular vein. And so when it comes to du'as and supplication, we don't yell and scream at the top of our lungs. When it comes to ziyarat, when we go to the harams, there's no need to yell the ziyarat out to, bother other people. And all of these aspects of Islam, there's moderation even in the way you recite. Even the Quran tells us when it comes to the salat, don't raise your voice so loud, nor so quiet that you can't even hear yourself, that it's a thought in the head. But Allah says, choose a path between the two. So we have to ensure that we always are calm and collected. Whether we have disagreements, we have fights, we have people who are not in agreement with one another at a level of a family, a community, at work, at school. It should never get to the point where we are yelling and screaming at one another. And last but not least, as we see that as the verse says, that screaming and shouting is something discouraged and detested. And as Allah mentions that inna ankar al-aswat la sawtul hamir, that just think Allah is saying when you scream and shout, He's comparing you to a donkey. Right? That should be enough for us to get the point of that, for Allah to get the point across. That if you don't want to be called a donkey who's making this braying noise, a very annoying sound, then ensure that you don't act in that way. And if you don't act like a donkey, then there's no need for people to call you a donkey, or to use the other word for a donkey, which I won't use tonight. But if you don't act like it, people won't call you it. But if you have that kind of attitude, if you're going to be like that, then expect people to call you a donkey, because you deserved it, because you have reduced yourself from the level of a human being to being like an animal. And even worse than an animal, because the donkey, it's not his fault he makes that noise. Right? That's what Allah gave him as a way to speak. But you and I, Allah gave us a beautiful voice. He gave us intellect. And so when we use that intellect, or rather when we don't use that intellect, then we have a right to be called an animal, or worse than the animals. We close and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we continue in this month of Ramadan, and we come in the last phase of the last 3 or 4 days of the month of Ramadan, that He accepts our acts of worship that we have carried out so far. We ask Allah to give us the tawfiq to continue to fast in these last few days, to stand for worship in the night, to recite of the Quran and to understand the Quran. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the advent of our 12th Imam, Imam al-Hujjah. We ask Allah to give the thawab of this program tonight, of the surahs, of the du'as, to all of the marhumin, all of those who have left this world, from our families, our communities, our friends, the ulama, the shuhada. Let us close and remember all of them this evening with a surah Fatiha, but before that, one salawat upon Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.